Record to this computer. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. We are recording on a Sunday afternoon, and we're excited that you'll get to see this whenever you want, wherever you want, you who's out there watching. My name is Francisca Porchas Coronado, and we have a special offering for you all today. Really excited. I'm sharing my screen so that you all can see a little bit. Oh, not my daughter. Let's see where you be. So you all can see a little bit about what we put together. So again, my name is Francisca Porchas Coronado, and welcome to the webinar by Latinx Therapist Action Network. We'll tell you a little bit more about who we are and our intentions for this webinar. But first and foremost, we want to say thank you for your time and energy. Thank you for coming into the cyberspace with us. And like I said, this is an offering to our Latinx community. Really excited to share some of what we know and hope that you find it helpful and that it brings curiosity, that it brings some level of understanding, and that also helps you ground a bit on some of what you probably already know, and then also open up to new possibilities and greater understanding. So thank you. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about who this network is, and then we're going to introduce ourselves individually. So the Latinx Therapist Action Network is a network that we're all a part of. It's been sort of incubating now for a good year, and folks that are on the call, on the video call, joined at different points. And really it's Latinx mental health practitioners that are committed to honoring and affirming the human dignity of Latinx immigrant communities, marginalized by violence, criminalization, detention, and deportation. And we hope that the work that we've all come together to do will, in some form or another, bring some level of relief, but also support and love to our folks. And so with that being said, before I go a little bit more into what the network is, we want to introduce ourselves, who we are, and what the intentions are for this webinar. So we'll start with who we are. Again, my name is Francisca Porchas Coronado. I'm the founder of the network. I am based in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. My preferred gender pronoun is she and hers. And my intention for this webinar is that our people who are out there listening, watching, will be able to be affirmed about how they've been feeling, what they're noticing in their own community, both the emotional state and the physical state of our folks, and that they're reminded of how incredibly powerful and beautiful we are, and about the possibilities for our own transformation. So that's sort of my intention in us going into Bienestar and well-being, and what it is and how we just define it from our own cultural perspective. So with that, we'll go to the East Coast. Maybe we can start with Ida.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Aida Mandule Escribano. I am currently based out of Boston, but I'm originally from Puerto Rico. So I'm here representing los Boricuas and also los Cubanos. My pronoun is they, them, theirs, so it's a little bit more flexible in Spanish. And as far as discipline and kind of what brought me here, I'm trained as a social worker and I work as a therapist, but a lot of my training is in sexual health and community organizing as well. So my intention for this webinar is to share information, have a discussion with some amazing people here, so that we can really talk about what mental wellness looks like and what it is not, because we're suffering, and there are ways that we can alleviate that suffering. And man, isn't that great? Wouldn't that be great if more of us had resources and information so that we could do that, especially in this current political climate that is bringing a lot of us down. So that's my goal here, to share that information and build community with folks that are listening.
Hi, should I go next? Hi.
Yes, go for it.
My name is Lina Barbanes Santiago. I'm also an immigrant. I was born and raised in France, and my mom was Puerto Rican. So I'm here in New York now. I use she, her, hers. I'm a social worker student. I'm about to graduate this year, and my intentions are to normalize the discussion about mental health and share resources and share healing. And I think that's a very powerful political tool, what we're doing now. So hopefully it can reach a lot of people.
And that leaves me. Hi, I'm Blanca Valentin, original de Puerto Rico, and I live in the Boston area. I've been in this area for over 35 years. I'm a licensed mental health clinician, but currently I'm a director of a community service agency, supporting those in the community. And I've been doing mental health work for over 20 years, and particularly with Latinx community in the Boston area. My intentions for this webinar is to have an open and frank and supportive conversation with like minds around how mental health and mental illness is impacting our communities, and how we as a community can support each other in the healing of such. And my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now that you know a little bit about us and our intentions for the webinar, we want to take you through this nifty presentation that we put. So a little bit about the tenets of the Latinx Therapist Action Network, just so you know. It is a profoundly political collective, and we came together to build the resilience of the migrant rights movement and its leadership through mental health education, because we know that our folks that are on the front lines are some of our bravest folks. There are the people that are putting their bodies on the line, I think, to really shift the material conditions of the community, and we want to make sure that we tend to their overall well-being. And then also build the consciousness of Latinx therapists about issues of criminalization, incarceration, migration. So many of our folks that are out there who are in the mental health field are very aligned with pro-immigrant rights, with the critique of the carceral system in this country and what it does to people of color, especially Black and Brown. So it is to continue to politicize healing as an art and as work, and also politicize the consciousness of these healers, because that's how we see mental health professionals in our community. Stand in solidarity with the migrant rights movement to stop migrant criminalization, detention, and deportation. So we know that there are these flashpoint moments that are really important in our community, where we can really challenge, how this administration is going about persecuting and criminalizing, and that there's going to be moments where the migrant rights movement is going to call on us for support, and that we'll be able to be supportive in some way or another. And again, build a directory of licensed and also a directory of peer supporters that are mental health unlicensed folks. So both licensed Latinx therapists and mental health professionals that might not necessarily be licensed, who are open to peer support, who can be of literal, who can bring emotional support in a grounded manner to our community, whether that is when folks are being released at the level of hundreds from detention across the country, from detention centers, to folks who might have been in the country for a long time and are being persecuted, to folks who have been criminalized and are living in fear, or people who are undocumented who are still living in fear of what their life is going to look like. So there's a lot of ways in which that could take form, but that's one of the main tenets of this network. So with that, because we want to ground this conversation in something that's really important, which is, there's who we are and who we walk as in the world. Myself, Francisca, Aira, Lina, or Blanca. So much of who we are is made up by really all the spaces that we're in and all the phenomenon that sort of influence us. And so we want to make sure that, sometimes mental health is talked about in such an isolated way, like it's you and your demons, and you're sort of trying to figure it all out without really having a more profound analysis or more encompassing analysis of the world, essentially, and how social being creates social consciousness. As one of my heroes, revolutionary heroes, said once. So more to name that, we want to preface this conversation by saying that we're highly influenced by nature and what's happening in our surroundings. And by nature, I legit mean access to water, access to clean air, access to, all of the natural resources that we're supposed to innately have access to, and that also really impact the way that we feel, and whether we're sick, whether we're healthy, how we relate. Society, media, culture, hegemony is, I think, something that is important to name. So much makes a part of our culture. I don't even know where to start or end, or where it started or ended, and for how many hundreds of years. But we are in a very particular culture that sort of dictates how we're supposed to feel and who we are and how we're supposed to be. And then the level of agreement among, I think, everybody in this country, and the hegemony that we all sort of function, even when we think we're the most woke, there's still a high level of hegemony. And then institutions, right? There's government, church, schools, jobs. I mean, there's tons of institutions that, again, continue to influence who we are, how we think we're supposed to think and react and relate. Community, whether that's, a lot of folks were around, friends, and also family, right? And so, these bubbles are different sizes, and for many of us, family might take up, depending on what stage in our life we're at, a huge bubble, or community or institutions. And so all to say that this isn't a perfect sort of measurement of how we're influenced, but more to say that this is a mix of things, and that yes, we all are accountable to ourselves and responsible for how we act in some ways, but to be really clear that there are societal, institutional, environmental, familial, communal expectations and duties and judgments, and all of this sort of goes into us. And so with that being said, we wanted to just make sure we ground the conversation in that, and we'll go deeper into like the isms, like the fact that we suffer racism and homophobia and classism and sexism, and all these things that the society sort of reinforces, that we don't often get as an analysis in like mainstream mental health, the mental health world. So with that being said, we're going to move to the next, slide, and hand it over to Lina.
Thank you. So I'm going to start, I will be discussing the emotional landscape, and I'm going to start asking, what is an emotion? An emotion is a complex psychological state, and it involves three components. The first one is a subjective experience, whether it's internal or external. The second one is the physiological response, and the third one is the behavioral or expressive response. The last component, the behavioral one, is the one we're usually more familiar with, because it's the actual expression of our emotions. And indeed, we spend a lot of time trying to interpret and understand each other's emotional expressions. The second component is the physiological reaction, and it gets also a lot of attention because it's the reaction in our bodies that we can't really escape from, like when your stomach gets a little bit upset, when you're anxious, or when your heart starts to palpate, when you are scared, and these are the physiological responses from your body when you have an emotion. And these emotions are regulated by the nervous system, and it's the same nervous system that controls the body fight or flight reactions. So that's why it's a little bit outside your consciousness, and it's a reaction that you can see pretty quickly happening. The less known component of an emotion is the fact that it's a response to an experience, and these experiences can be just a big one or smaller ones. It can be just one. It can be a lifetime of several experiences and events, and it's sometimes underrated, and we don't talk too much about the fact that our experiences leave how would you say, like have consequences on the long term. And so we'll discuss later, I think, with Ida, and we'll discuss the fact that the three components come together, and even if you see just one, the physiological part of, or the behavioral one, the subjective experience is still there and is still having consequences on your well-being. And you can go to the next slide, Francisca. So just a little doodle to explain why we like to talk about emotional landscape, because everybody experiences a wide range of emotions with nuances and depending intensities, varying intensities. So the emotional landscape we're talking about here is dynamic, and it changes with the level of stimulation. So
I think Lena froze.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Well, we can pinch hit.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want, I can pinch hit for her while she's away, and if she comes back, we can give it on back. Part of what Lena was talking about was this idea that we all experience a lot of different emotions, and different people may have different emotional responses to the same kind of event. She was also talking a little bit earlier about this idea that we have these different components, the physiological, the behavioral, the subjective, and that as we move through life, we essentially start getting trained on how to react to things. And so if we start learning about our feelings as children, that is all information that we keep carrying into adulthood. So things that we learned about how we're supposed to behave and what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to feel get ingrained in us very early. It doesn't mean we can't change them later on, but it means that if we want to, there's some baggage that we have to deal with. Lena, you're back. I was just talking about past and its influence on the present. So if you want, you can continue with what you were saying earlier. And you're muted, I think. Lena, I think you're muted. There you go.
I can't hear you. There you go. Go for it.
Hi, technology. Okay, I'm back for real now. Thank you, Ida, for jumping in. I just wanted to add that our emotional landscape is very important for us to make decisions and take action and survive. And also mostly understand each other and also be understood by others, so that for me is very important, the relational part of it. Can we go to the next slide? So yeah, what it is made of. So there are a few things: emotions, feelings, and moods. Sometimes these words are used interchangeably. I would like to go over a few differences. So, for example, a mood is usually a milder than an emotion, but it's longer lasting. In many cases, it can be difficult to identify a specific cause for the mood, whereas the emotion, as I said, has usually a specific subjective experience as its root. And also emotions are generated subconsciously, whereas feelings are driven by conscious thoughts and reflections. So that's the main differences between emotions and feelings and moods. Behaviors are a range of actions and include the way we conduct ourselves, and especially the way we conduct ourselves with other people. And it's very important when we talk about behavior, because it implies the relationship that we have, and it's a lot more concrete and observable that the subjective experience of emotions. Thoughts and ideas are produced by thinking and reflecting, believing and learning. So it includes the stories that we remember, that we tell ourselves, that we tell everybody. It includes the relationships we have with our family, with our partners, with the world. The body sensations and come out with emotions in their physiological aspect, and they are not only observable on the face and arms, or for example we frown, or arms, legs when we shake, for example, or skin, but also the internal organs are impacted, and specifically the brain, whose functioning is modified by emotions. And lastly, spirituality and a sense of connection with a higher purpose is intimately linked to emotions, and is often related to a sense of calm and wonder and awe, but also can be related to shame and guilt and blame and rage in difficult times. So that's why we like the emotional landscape, because it's made of very diverse aspects. Can we go to the next slide?
Lena, one of the things that you said too made me think of the difference between weather and climate. when you were talking about emotions versus feelings versus moods,
Yeah.
where climate is the kind of averaging of a lot of different kinds of weather over a period of time. Like, oh, this is tropical climate, it's generally this, versus, oh, it's super raining and that's the weather. That feels like the difference between the emotion and feeling being the in the moment and variable piece, and the mood being the kind of longer term averaged out version. So that was just something I was like, oh, hey, if someone else is having maybe a hard time understanding that but knows about weather, maybe that's that's something that'll make sense for their brain.
Yeah, that's a very useful analogy. Thank you. Also, we wanted to touch upon a social functioning and emotional landscape because of what we said earlier and the political aspect of feeling well and healing. We want to underline that social functioning is just not what you do, like the behavior and the relationships that you have, but also how you feel and what you think. So that this is where emotions and thoughts and belief really can shape your behavior and your relationship and your whole life, really. The mainstream scientific community, which is mostly capitalist and behaviorist, focuses on the productivity and assesses patients in terms of functioning or fulfillment of their social obligations. But we kind of want to challenge this approach a little bit and touch on something more internal and value-based and community-based. So we want to take the holistic approach to mental health. And if we can go to the last slide, it's just a last doodle to show you a little bit how we all have different emotional landscapes, and they are not necessarily comparable. The same experience, the same loss can mean different things on someone's emotional landscape, and that's why we need to take into account the community and the culture that people are from.
I think especially in this country, inside the US, many of us as people who aren't from, this country, and I think there's a lot of cultural shock coming in and feeling like there's a certain level of productivity that you need to uphold, and that being really shocking to your body and to your psyche, whereas what was valued, what was important, relationships are very valued, they're important, community, collectivity, the vecinos, the vecinas, the comadre, compadre, whatever, versus literally getting up and every single day and just literally busting your ass at whatever economic level you are to be able to produce, to be able to fulfill that thing that you came to this country for, and then feeling in a lot of ways deflated at the end of the day and not having much to show for. And so in some ways it's like both your mental state could be, your quote unquote capitalist productivity could be impacted, and also the productivity obligations can be the thing that then ends up impacting your emotional state and it being such a cultural shock. But that's the thing that it made me think of as you were talking about this quote unquote social functioning and the difference between that, what it means here and what it means in some of our countries.
For sure. And I mean, there's also the piece around just because something was okay in our home country or just because something is cultural doesn't mean it's good. There's a lot of, bad habits that I'm sure many of us learned or have. And not saying that American white habits are necessarily better or that we should replace them with that, but that we need to be conscientious and thoughtful about, okay, what are the cultural things that I want to keep? What are the values that I actually want to keep? and not just assume that it has to be the one that you grew up with or the one that you're being given societally. There's usually a third way and other ways that we can think about things. And kind of back to the political project of it, before I talk about what is wellness, you know, the reason that we want to underscore, it's not just about being productive. It's not just about, can you go to your job? It's because, you know, if you want to die every day that you go to your job, you can still go to your job. You're still maybe making money. You're still paying rent, but you feel like crap. And that impacts how you behave around other people. That impacts how you feel about yourself. If you have children or if you have family, that impacts how you treat them. So there's a lot about, you know, the ways that we deal with our mental health and our mental state that radiates outward beyond ourselves and is affected by so many things that are not just ourselves. That to talk about just the inside or just the outside misses a huge part of the picture. The other piece, and sort of transitioning into this slide that Francisca just put up for us, we often talk about illness, but we don't necessarily say what wellness is. Like, what are we supposed to be striving for? And so for our definition here, spoiler alert, we're going to kind of give you a definition, but not, because we want you to make your own. The idea here is that wellness is both a state and a process. It's not just, I'm well or I'm unwell. I'm healthy, I'm unhealthy. We want to move away from that black and white thinking, because it doesn't actually help us very much. It's the easier way out. It's not the best way out. And so for us, it's this active process of growing and learning, of moving toward balance, naming and acknowledging all the different parts that make us up and that affect our internal state. And in the slideshow, if you can see, there's a sentence that says, having the internal and external resources to lead a good life. And the word good is highlighted in pink and it's in brackets. And the reason I did that is because, you know, we don't necessarily have to share the definition. And maybe one of us here says, I want to have the resources to lead a successful life. But someone else says, I want to lead a good life. Someone else says, I want to lead a healthy life. We can put whatever adjective we want in there. It doesn't have to look the same for everyone. And in fact, that's the next point, right? That people are going to have different ways of naming and measuring what wellness looks like for them. And that's okay. One of the difficulties with the mental health care system is that often we're using a very specific, narrow idea of what wellness is that has values embedded into it and politics embedded into it, even when we're told, this is objective. This is just an objective measure of how wellness works. And so what we want to encourage people to do with this webinar is start thinking about, what does this look like for them, right? So with the National Wellness Institute, they define it as an active process, same as we said, active process, and they focus on making choices and being aware and having a quote unquote successful existence. If that's something that makes sense for you and feels like it's a good fit, awesome. If it doesn't, then that's also fine, because you get to build your own definition of what wellness is. Next slide, please. And as we're talking about, I think we went backwards. Oh, no, there we go. So the question that often comes up is, okay, we're talking about wellness. Is that the same thing as happiness? Am I supposed to be happy all the time? Because if so, I'm failing. And I'm here to tell you no, right? Being well or having wellness or bienestar does not mean that you get to be happy all the time or that you should expect that. It's not the same. And furthermore, being well or having wellness or being on a path to wellness does not mean just avoiding bad feelings or avoiding disease. It means being able to be open to the realm of human possibility, the realm of emotions, even ones that feel hard, even ones that feel quote unquote bad. The bad feelings can sometimes be our greatest teachers. So things like grief, things like stress, things like anger. A lot of us are told, oh, you shouldn't be feeling that, or you need to tamp that down or calm down, calmate. When instead, a maybe more helpful question would be, what does this emotion have to teach me right now? Why is it coming up? These things are not random, right? Even if it's just a chemical imbalance in our brain, even if it's just that, which it rarely just is, there's something that it can tell us about how we are in the world. What are the things that are making us feel better or worse? And there's a book that is not perfect, but a book called Healing Through the Dark Emotions, The Wisdom of Grief, Fear, and Despair by a woman named Miriam Greenspan, that talks a lot about this idea of we have so much to learn from these emotions that we tend to dissociate from and kind of push aside. And part of the point that she also makes is that when we push these feelings aside, they don't just go away. They usually fester. They usually turn into something more maybe harmful to us in our society. So if we hide a frustration, maybe it boils out into rage and it leads to community pain in a way that it didn't really have to if we had just dealt with it when we initially felt it. So I want to, very much encourage us to think about wellness. Again, we use the word holistic like 20 times already, but with this framework of having options and having a bigger menu of feelings that we can access. And there's a lot of stuff that can impact how many feelings we can access, but even knowing that there's a lot of them out there can be a starting point. And so another resource that's on this slide is the Feelings Wheel. Just go to feelingswheel.com. And it's really helpful, or it can be really helpful for people to see, hey, what am I feeling right now? We rarely feel just one thing at a time. And so I like to think of it like a pie chart where you can be feeling 20% frustrated, 30% happy, 10% angry. I'm not counting to 100, but imagine a pie chart and going to 100. And so the more that we can talk about the different feelings we're feeling at a time, the better understanding we'll have about what's going on in ourselves and how to communicate that to another person. So I have a lot of clients that carry their phones in their pockets and they have a little shortcut to the feelings wheel. So when they are freaking out or when they're upset or when they're really excited or when they have to talk to someone and they're like, I don't know what I'm feeling, they pull that sucker up and they're like, all right, I'm feeling like I'm in the angry quadrant. What specific feeling? I'm feeling pissed off, or I'm feeling really sad, or I'm feeling ashamed, or I'm feeling lonely. And by being able to use more of these words, we can usually nail down a better idea of what's going on and have people actually be able to respond to our needs versus I'm sad, I'm mad, I'm happy. Those are important, but not very detailed. And so if we can get more detail, that usually gives us more room for understanding ourselves in a context. Next slide, please. So related to that, right? We just said what is not mental wellness. It's not about just being happy. What is mental wellness and emotional wellness? A lot of people, like I said, might define it differently. Some words that come up for folks are balance, peace. Some people will say happiness. Some people will say success. Again, we just invite you to think about what does it mean for you. The one thing that we want to kind of bring up again is that it's not just black or white. It's not just you're either good or bad. And that mental and emotional wellness is about a lot of abilities that we have or don't have at a given time. So it's about our ability to name and understand our feelings. That's related to the feelings wheel, right? Our ability to cope with difficult situations, our ability to access resources that address our needs and wants, our ability to create and benefit from networks of care and support, whether that's in person or not, our ability to adapt to life circumstances and changes, and our abilities to make choices that move us closer to our better selves. With that all said, it's also, again, really important to bring the politics here. Difficult situations are not always meant to be endured and endured well, right? Mm-hmm. As clinicians, one of the conversations that a lot of us have is, how are we preparing people to live in the world when the world is unfair? And what is our duty to help people cope with their oppression, right? If someone's coming to us talking about a really terrible work environment and we're only thinking, well, you should really be doing X, Y, Z to feel more okay at your job, and not looking at the ways in which their job might be crushing their soul, we're missing a big piece of the picture. So for us to be responsible clinicians and for us as a community to have a really responsible conversation, we have to look at not just how we cope and not just how we adapt, but why we're being forced sometimes to do that. And another piece here is understanding why some people use the strategies that they use to survive. Because we can say, oh, this person's not coping well. Sure, maybe for you, they're not coping well, but they're maybe trying to do the best thing for themselves at the time, because that's maybe only, what they have access to, or what they feel is best, or what's helping them live through a situation that's hard. So with a lot of this, part of what we want to share with y'all too is this idea of how can we bring compassion into it. One of my favorite questions is, how does this make sense for this person? Especially if I'm like, wow, this sounds terrible, I would never do this. There's something about it that makes sense to the person. So asking ourselves that instead of using just our framework for if it makes sense to us, saying, how does this make sense to you? Because it does. Maybe we don't understand it yet, but we might be able to if we ask and if we actually have a conversation. So the question that I want to bring to the group here and to the folks that are listening to us at home or wherever you are, is a set of 3 queries. 1, what things sustain you? 2, what nourishes you? Which might be different than the first, might not. And then 3, how can you tell you're feeling and doing well? What are the markers that you can notice in your day-to-day or in your body or in your relationships that signal to you, all right, I'm doing pretty okay. Things are all right. And I can certainly answer, but I'm curious if any of the folks on the call have things that they're willing to share first.
I could go. I think, what the sustaining and the nourishing for me is like 1 and 1. And I feel like I've been having this conversation lately a lot. And one of the things that sustains me is my friends. Like I have a number of circles of friends that where I am on the flip side of that, right? On the not to the bad side, or not feeling well, or really being challenged, that I could call to a community that truly sustains me and nourishes me in many aspects. And when I know that I call on them is, the not knowing when I'm not doing well or when I'm not feeling well. What I know about myself is I isolate. That is a telltale sign for me where, I may not answer phone calls. Texts may go, days without being answered. And I know that that's where my zone is. And so what I've shared with friends is like, if you don't hear back from me in a day, know that you call me, I'm probably in my zone. And so being able to name it, but also being able to share with my community, this is where I am, and these are probably some of the times that I'm struggling. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine recently, and she said, oh, I didn't know about you. I didn't know that about you. Thanks for letting me know. And so she's been checking in on me when she doesn't hear from me. So just relationships, they both sustain and nourish me.
Awesome. Thank you, Blanca. Lina, Francisca, do either of you want to share?
Yeah, I think for me as an immigrant in New York, I think community was really important, and it took me a while to find it and to really be able to open up and get this nourishment from it. But I finally found it, and I think to answer your last question about how you can tell, for me, it would be when stars align, kind of, and you don't have to force so many things. I don't know how to explain it. It's things become a little bit easier, and you're easier on yourself as well. And I think that's what it feels like when I'm feeling well.
Awesome. Thank you, Lina. Francisca, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, thank you. It really resonated with me when you said, like, sometimes we operate from our own framework of like how we think somebody should feel or what we would do or wouldn't do. And I think that that's definitely something that resonates a lot with me in terms of family and how, sadly judgmental my family could be about where folks are at. There's a lot of mental illness in my family. And I think that the folks that do have mental illness are just very much not understood, which mental, quote unquote illness or that imbalance that our folks suffer from. It's hard to understand. but at the same time, there's just so much judgment. So anyway, I was just kind of thinking about that and how we kind of come from our own frameworks, and ignoring maybe people's own ability to build their own safety, right? And so anyway, for me, I think the things that sustain me is going back to the family stuff, is creating really healthy boundaries. I think that has been probably one of my Achilles heel, has been not creating healthy boundaries, and somebody who's been in movement for the last almost 20 years, just really burning myself out and being so tired, and that tiredness leading me to exhaustion, and then also to resentment of like all kinds of stuff that I love. So I think that the healthy boundaries has really been my guiding sort of principle the last few years, where I was like, I can do this in a sustainable way that isn't violating all kinds of basic rules that I should have for myself around sleep and my overall health and the space that I need. And so boundaries, so I know that I feel good when I know I'm boundaried in a healthy way, in a principled way, and learning to say no to a lot, because you can get very easily sucked into so much, and that nothing's gonna happen if I say no. Like, if people love you and care about you, and they will understand. So that's when I know I'm like doing good. And then also lately, like creativity. Once I started creating healthy boundaries, I was like, oh my God, I'm generative. Like, I'm not just like being pulled along, like I'm on skates and somebody's like dragging me behind them. I literally feel generative and creative, and I have ganas, and that is something that like life energy that's supposed to flow through you to have you have creativity and energy can be really just almost non-existent when you're exhausted and resentful. And so that's what it looks like to me these days.
Hell yeah. I'm just like, amen. Yes to everything. And I mean, that resonates with me too. The thing that nourishes me and kind of sustains me, especially as, a practitioner in mental health, but also as a movement worker, is knowing I'm not alone in doing any of the work I'm doing. Because it can feel extremely overwhelming if it feels like, well, you're the make or break it person. No one in the world will be able to do the same job that you can do. And certainly, we all have our unique talents, and we all, might be the one person for someone. But in the large scheme of things, when I zoom out, I know that there's other people in solidarity and in movement that are also doing this work. So I don't feel alone, and that feels really useful. And I'm not Jewish, but there is a piece of Jewish text that a partner of mine shared with me. I'm not going to try to quote it because I'll butcher it, but a big part of it was just because you can't finish the job doesn't mean you get to quit. And the idea is that we're part of a line of ancestors and a line of descendants, that we're all working on this together, that again, that none of us are alone. And that is really important to me. And how I can tell I'm doing well, kind of like Lena said, it feels like life is more lubricated. There's like a greater ease to doing things. And I have more trust in people. When I'm not feeling well, I know that I can get hypercritical. I know that I can see all the things that are wrong with like my house, and this isn't clean, and this person said this thing, and so I start nitpicking when I'm not doing well. And when I am, I have a greater ease with either letting things go or understanding someone's perspective. I have more empathy for people. I have more compassion. I sleep better. Like, there's so many physical and emotional things that signal to me I'm doing well or not. And I track it. Like, I track moods, especially for people who menstruate. That can be really helpful, since any hormonal change can affect our emotional state. And sometimes I'm like, wow, I want to rip everyone's face off. What's up with that? And, if I have context for it and I know my usual mood, it can help me understand, oh, I'm probably PMSing and it's going to be gone by tomorrow. Or, wow, I am certainly not PMSing. Someone just did something really hurtful and I need to talk to them. But, this question, or these sets of questions, brings us to the spot of, okay, so if this is wellness, what is illness? If this is how I can tell I'm doing well, what about when I'm not doing well? And who defines that? And so I want to toss it over to my comrade Blanca, who's going to talk a little bit about that piece.
Mm-hmm. And the mystery, right? And I appreciate, Ida, what you said earlier about the good versus bad. And truly, it's not about good versus bad. It's about having the understanding, having the tools, having the knowledge to put words to what we are experiencing. And I've been doing this for a very long. I've been doing this for a very long time. And in my journey, first as a social worker, working with families, and then it's like organically turning into deciding that working with the community, Latino community in particular, around mental health is where I wanted to be. Was this the misunderstanding of what was happening, particularly with children, right? There's so many layers to us. There are the individuals, with the family, there's the community. But one of the things that I learned is about being able to speak with, whether it was the parent or the youth, about what they were experiencing at the moment, right? And if we know, particularly whether it's as a migrant or immigrant in our communities, is why is mental illness or mental, well-being seen in the way that it is? Why is it seen as a weakness? And why do we suffer? A lot of us suffer in silence. And why do we keep it quiet, right? And so there are so many different points as to why that is, right? Like, it's a personal issue. How many of us have heard, los trapos sucios se lavan en la casa? And so we keep it in our homes. We normalize it. The fear of being labeled, or the stigma of being, crazy, being labeled crazy. I know this was years ago. This was freshly out of college, and one of my first jobs out of college. It was this young lady who had a 5-year-old daughter, and she was concerned about the fact that her daughter was seeing things. And she's like, I'm afraid that my child will be taken away. So the fear, it's not, for me, yes, stigma it's like a grain, but it's truly about the fear of the unknown. And once we understand and we, to extent, normalize what our children or our families or our partners are experiencing, then we're able to understand it, right? And, and I said earlier, it's like, this is the real thing. And, no pun intended when I say it's not in our heads. Like, this is something that we are seeing in our communities. This is something that we are, that we're labeling, right? Ataque de nervios. I think that's something that in no matter where you are in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's a known term. But what does that truly mean? La depre. Right? Like, the person is feeling blue, the person is feeling sad. And, that must be, they'll get over it, right? And so so what happens when we don't get over it? What happens when this depre turns into our inability to function on a day-to-day, to truly show up for our families, to show up to work and be productive? So how is it that we, what would it mean that we change the focus on the physical rather than, the mental, or how we are experiencing our mental health? Do any of you want to add anything to that?
One of the things that we were talking about earlier too, right, is that especially for a lot of Latinx folks, we often start off with a physical symptom before we're like, oh, my emotions. We're like, I have a migraine, I have a stomach ache. Like, I know that as a child, and this is just a quick story, as a child, when I used to get scared, I just thought I had to poop. I didn't know what fear was. And so, or I knew what fear was when there was a monster. Like, I know el cuco, like, I know that I'm afraid of that. We got that. But if I was afraid of getting on a ride or, getting on a roller coaster, I had no language for that. And so I would just talk about my stomach feeling like it was in knots and it hurting. And so my parents, listened, and they would take me to the bathroom. Nothing would happen over and over until we realized, oh, you're scared. This is not just your stomach, but it is also your stomach. And one of the pieces that often comes up with our communities is this question of, is this in your head? Are you making it up? Blah, blah, blah. And there's this really amazing book that we have listed in our resources at the end called Is It All in Your Head? True Stories of Imaginary Illness by Suzanne O'Sullivan. She's not Latinx, but a lot of the information can be really valuable because it talks about psychosomatic illness and how even when something is quote unquote all in our head is our brain, is an organ. And a lot of our brain controls a heck of a lot of things in our bodies. And so even if something is all in our head, it's still worth treating. It's still worth acknowledging. It's still worth addressing. And we ignore it at our peril, right? And so we need to be focusing on the physical symptoms and the emotional parts and not assuming that they're separate, but just seeing what is their relationship and what can they tell us about the other one.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that because there's one of the thoughts that I had as I was preparing for this was exactly that, how we treat mental illness como si fuera el cuco under our beds. And what happens when you sit and talk to the cuco, right? What if you are curious about what is happening, right? Is it truly there to scare you, or is it there to create some awareness about your experience? And so the moment that we are curious about what we are experiencing, what my mother is experiencing, what my sibling is experiencing, we are better able to understand it because it is something that is real. And our next slide will give us a little context as to what the reality of mental illness truly is in our community. So it has a greater impact. 1 in 5 Latinx suffer from a medical health condition. So think about 5 people that you know. 1 of those 5 people are experiencing any of these, which are some of the most commons, right? Just to put a name behind, what these may look like. Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And what does that mean to know, to be aware that 1 in 5 people are suffering this way? What happens? What is carrying these things? How does that impact ourselves? How is it that it is disconnecting us from each other? How is it that the isolation that that it often, particularly when we are living. I remember when I first moved here from Puerto Rico, I was 10 years old. I remember the disconnect. I live in Puerto Rico in 80-degree weather and arriving to Boston in the middle of the winter. One of the things that I encourage, my staff now that I'm supervising those who are on the front lines, is that one of the things that we don't often talk about is engaging families around discussions around their migration stories. When we're talking about diagnosing, whether it's depression, anxiety, or of trauma, how often, right? There's this check mark, through the DSM-5, but how often are we asking families to share their migration stories with us? How often are we asking families to talk about their still connections to home? I still have all my family in Puerto Rico. And even though my body is in Boston, my heart is in Puerto Rico. And how often are we, nuestra familia en Mexico, en El Salvador, like we are really split. And that does something to our ability to truly be present and caring for ourselves. And so I want all of us to explore and to really be curious about what it is that we're carrying, because we are more than just our symptoms. We are more than just la depre or, el dolor del corazón, que truly is something that's real and it has an impact into how we, sorry about that.
Oh no, you muted yourself.
Okay, yeah, here I am.
You're back.
I'm back. It has an impact about how we show up. But one thing that I know, and I think this is something that across the board we could relate to as Latino, is the kick-ass resilience that we portray. Y no es para, it's not to like cover the sadness. It's not to cover, but there is, this amazing love of life that even with the most challenging of times that we are able to show up with, right? And how can we tap into that? When we're isolated, you know, we're so connected to community in so many ways. And when we're isolating, when we are feeling all of these things, we're less likely to do that. How can we remind ourselves of the love, of the joy, of, you know, of the music that connects us, the language that connects us? And I think that's why, you know, when they talk about assimilation, we are the less likely to assimilate, because we are so in need of the connecting, you know, of that connects us to our roots, you know, our language, our foods, our music. And so being able to tap into those things when we are experiencing the challenges that a true mental illness can give us.
Mm-hmm.
So moving to the next slide.
It also makes me think of, if I can add, Blanca, about, you know, the reason why we don't so many of us like don't assimilate, you know, in the classic sense as is defined by, you know, the countries. It's like all the things you named are resources. So those are like our resilience resources. That's how we build resiliency. So like we've survived crazy, you know, journeys here, the shock of like where we are and what now is the new reality. So it's like, how do we resourcing ourselves, and the things you named around music and people and costumbres, and food, and, you know, all these other things that are our resource. And to give up that resource then would really do mean the quote unquote assimilation, but would really do a whole lot of damage to our spirits, you know, or what, holding on to our own resource, internal resource and collective resource. So anyway, just kind of made me think about that.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that, you know, we're often, you know, when we're in the midst of it, and, you know, there is a cost to carrying all these burdens. There is a cost to suffering and silence. And one of the things that I encourage you, whoever you may be, who are experiencing these things, is to be brave. There is no shame in asking for help. There is no shame in saying, hoy no puedo, right? En es el momento, right? At the moment, right now, I'm challenged. And what are those things that can support me and help me so that I could get over that hump? And what happens, you know, if we don't? What is the cost of carrying the burden of our stories, of our traumas, of our sadness, of our isolation? And, you know, this slide I love, right? Because if one of these little pebbles signifies a stress that we experience in a life, right, at a single moment, imagine what happens, you know, when you are collecting these pebbles through a lifetime. And one of the things that I want to mention is that mental illness does not discriminate. It impacts in every single aspect of our lifetime. Children, you know, I remember once upon a time when I was seeing, you know, seeing clients, my youngest client was a 4-year-old little boy. My oldest was a 93-year-old, right? And so mental illness does not discriminate. We are carrying. And so I often think about this 93-year-old man and the pebbles that he collected throughout his lifetime, that at one point becomes a boulder. And for the last 3 years that I saw him, it was about reminiscing about his life and just being able to be okay with the choices that he made, right? And how brave of him at 93 to say, I want to be okay with the choices that I've made. And so the strides that he made in 3 years, right? Pero ¿por qué sufrir por tanto tiempo? Because there was so much more, and he transitioned at 96. But how much more they would have been, right? And how much more healing could have happened if he decided to release these pebbles throughout his lifetime, instead of often, you know, we see the children, like my daughters used to collect these pebbles when they were little. And now they collect them. I actually had, my daughter just got back from South Africa and she brought me, and now we collect them for different purposes. This is from the Indian Ocean in South Africa. So, now we collect them, and this is by choice, right? But what happens, we are collecting these pebbles of sorrow, of sadness, of frustration, of anger throughout our lifetime. And so be brave.
Yeah, Lena, it sounds like you want to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the resilience, because I think it's a like popular word that is thrown around, and especially in regards to immigrants, we tend to think it's how well immigrants push through and how much they endure, and the narrative of the good immigrant that is capital, like in a capitalist way, productive and participate to the economy. And I would like to challenge that, because that's not what resilience is. And as Blanca and Francisca said, that it's more about how you tap into your resources, and a lot of these resources are found in your community. So just challenging the current narrative about what resilience is and how much you need to go through and prove yourself to this new country. That I think is detrimental for communities.
And there's a resource that Lina shared with us. It's listed in the resources section for the webinar, an NPR article about recharging versus enduring, right? Because que conveniente, how convenient is it for us for our egos to be stroked like, oh my God, you're so resilient, you're so amazing, when the reason that someone is telling us that is because it is convenient for them to continue stepping on us and stroke our ego by saying, you're holding that, boot at your neck really well, doing a super job. And rather than looking at resilience, as Lina said, as what are you surviving? How can we move that frame to thriving? How do we move that frame to recharging? How do we move that frame to not having to just barely survive, but actually feel a little bit better, have some of the stuff that we talked about when we talked about wellness, and how for a lot of our communities, again, beyond the stigma and the fear that we're going to talk about in future webinars, right? Like, why is that there? What can we do about it? There can be so many challenges to getting help. Again, we'll cover that in future webinars. And one of the stumbling blocks that affects a lot of the folks that I know is, to get help, you have to admit that something's wrong. To get help, you have to admit that something hurts you. And for people who are accustomed to being told that they have to be strong, that they have to be so resilient, that they can't not be okay, asking for help can sometimes make all of that crumble. And it's really scary. And that's one of the big blocks to being brave, like Blanca said, and being able to actually ask for help. And so, again, part of what we're trying to talk about here is not just the frame of admitting something is wrong, but thinking, okay, how can I in general work toward being a better version of myself? How can I in general work toward feeling better in my body and in the bodies around me? And I think that kind of brings us to this last slide one of the last slides about healing and shifting. And the knowledge that we have a lot of different tools to do this work. Therapy is one. A lot of us here are therapists. But therapy is not the only tool or even the best tool for every situation. We have circles, we have storytelling, we have testimonio, we have spiritual practices, whether or not that's organized. We have body movement, we have art. There's a picture on this slide of some comrades of mine from the Queer Kitchen Brigade who were giving aid after the Huracán Maria in Puerto Rico, and we're also giving aid to folks in Tijuana and the border. Particularly working at the intersection of community organizing and food making. And for a people that likes their food, isn't that an amazing intersection of community work, healing, personal growth, you know, helping others, feeling better, sharing in a sorrow or sharing in a struggle. And it doesn't have to just be talking. It doesn't have to just be talk therapy. But that can also be a really important component. So what we want you to think about, right, is what of these tools do you feel like you already have access to? What are tools you're curious about? What are tools that if you had access to, you would use, but you might not currently? Because this is part of why we're doing these webinars. We want to demystify some of these tools, make it easier for people to access them. And why is this even important in the first place, right? If we don't heal, if we don't take the time to build community, if we don't take the time to recharge, we're going to die. And I mean, we're all going to die already. We know that, but what happens in between, right? Like, what is the quality of life that we're going to get to have? And these kinds of healing projects and modalities are critical for us to survive. It's critical for our stories to survive, for the future generations to thrive. And we have to remember that none of us are alone in this, even if we feel like we might be. None of us are an island, even if we come from islands, right? Like, we are all part of a community, and sometimes we just are having a hard time getting access to that community. But there's a lot of us out here that are down for the struggle and want to help others find healing. And so we want to, unless someone has anything else that they want to share, we can maybe transition into a few of the questions to ponder as well.
The only thing that I wanted to share is that, you know, that when I started this work like 25 years ago, it was very isolating as the only, you know, at times the only Spanish-speaking Latina counselor, therapist. And so there's a movement of more like-minded and more people that look like me. And I so appreciate that. I so appreciate the collective, you know, the collective effort, that I am no longer just one. And so I just wanted to, you know, that there are more of us in the community that are doing this work. And so tapping into that, or being curious. And I'd love to hear, you know, what other people are doing and how other people are doing the healing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that both of you. That's actually a really, really good set of points to affirm for our folks. I think for a lot of the people that will be watching this webinar, listening to it, many of them are in movement, and by that meaning like social justice movement, in the work, and have found it as a resource for their own, like, you know, well-being and their people's well-being, and then also have found it to be the thing that's the hardest to navigate emotionally and physically. So it's like a very complicated sort of relationship to it. And so how do we do it in a more sustainable way where like the resource, you know, that thing that nourishes us outweighs all the other impact that is inevitable, because we're humans and we feel, and there's grief and there's pain and there's loss and there's all kinds of realities that, you know, state-sanctioned violence, in ways in which state-sanctioned violence manifests in our bodies and our collective and our communities and like our whole peoples, you know. But anyway, so thank you for that. I think things for you all to ponder and think about is, you know, what are we missing out on when we are not attuned to our needs? So I talked a little bit about, you know, boundaries being really important. So what is it that you need? Sometimes we don't even know how to answer that question, y'all. Like, because perhaps we're not attuned, perhaps nobody's ever asked us that, or we feel like nobody's ever cared. And so we sort of are, you know, for sure, like I relate a lot to what you were saying, Ida, about, you know, this thing about resilience and us being told we're resilient. So we have to kind of live up to that, whatever the hell that means to us and others. But it's like, you know, me having like for many years, like this whole brown woman syndrome of like strong brown woman syndrome, where like I have to sort of live up to this whatever definition of like not showing weakness or not showing that I need the help, or, you know, while there's like the burden of really intense sexist and patriarchal, you know, expectations. And so Maybe nobody's asked you. Ask yourself. Maybe you haven't asked yourself, So what are we paying attention to? Are we paying attention to our wellness and well-being? Like, are we paying attention to our bodies, the whole tracking thing that you were talking about earlier? What is our mind? Where is it at right now? What does it need? What's it telling you? What's your spirit telling you? What are emotions? What are the feelings, the sensations in your body telling you? Our body's so incredibly wise. Going back to the psychosomatic, that's why like curanderas of all types from all kinds of different, all across Latin America, it's one of our richest resource and ancestral like gifts, is curanderismo, because forget the Western like mental health field. It's like they knew psychosomatic, like they knew bodies, they knew, sobadas, and they knew how to like cure susto, which is trauma, really.
Right.
And so it's like, what are the sensations that we feel? What are sensations telling us? Whether it's something really intense, like, horrible stomach ache, to like mildly intense, to like cancer. There are reasons why we have cancer. Obviously, the chemicals we're exposed to, but also like the toxic emotions and toxic experiences we've had, abuse, etc. How do we break from the stigma of healing in community, sharing our stories, finding ways of creating balance and harmony? You're right, like Blanca, about we keep everything to ourselves. We're hypervigilant, we're paranoid, we are so scared of the chisme, because we do have a chisme culture in our culture. Like it's so chisme, it's chisme, and our worst fears that are, worst fears and demons will get out there and people will hear it. And vulnerability is such a scary thing for real reasons, because it's been, cheaply exploited in many ways. And so that's real. So how do we lean into vulnerability? How do we build trust? It's that could be a whole other webinar, right? But getting curious about it, and collectively, doing it collectively with chosen family. So what roles does depression play in creating and maintaining oppression? So that's the other thing. It's like, I'm a firm believer that trauma is a tool of state violence. Trauma has been a tool of the state, and trauma is natural. And that will be a whole nother webinar. But what is trauma? Trauma is a natural phenomenon in nature. Like, we all have really, really intense experiences that we're supposed to be able to discharge energetically. Our bodies know how to do that. Our hearts know how to do that. Our spirits know how to do that. But when you have a situation where you set up society in a way that you cannot ever feel safe, like the way that society is set up, as an oppressed person, as a queer person, or as a Black person, or as a, poor person, a migrant, undocumented person, like, safety is something that, you have to kind of create ongoingly, because the outside world isn't ever going to give you that quote unquote safety, and white supremacy. And so oppression is a tool of creating and sustaining and maintaining mental, spiritual, emotional, physical illness in our communities. And, let's think about that role. Let's center that a little bit and understand that it is beyond us and the individual, like we were talking about, right? There's some stuff that's internal, there's some stuff that's external. There's, both. And how does the external feed the internal? So things to ponder. And so we're definitely beyond the hour. So I just want to let you all know that there's resources here. You can always rewind this webinar to kind of go back to this page, and see some of the books that the folks on this call added for you all. What's an article or a book? My Grandmother's Hands that I see here is amazing. I just read it. The Body Keeps a Score. It was one of the first books that I read about trauma. So just, get curious about this stuff, and then also know that we're accessible, that we're trying to build, again, talking about building resilience, like building a resource for ourselves, understanding that we need it, understanding that it has to come from within our community as well. Who knows us best but us? And so visit, we're about to launch this. It hasn't been launched. I'm hoping that literally this week, coming up, which is the last week of March 2019. I don't know when you'll be watching this, but that Latinx Therapist Action Network.org will launch. You can also email me. I'm the coordinator, and, you know, can put you in touch with any of these amazing members of the network of presenters that we had today. So just know that we're accessible and literally an email away or a phone call away. And so thank you so much for being part of this webinar. Again, this is an offering from us to you, you know, and the wealth of knowledge and experience that are the folks that I'm gonna call mental health practitioners have had over many years. And then also them reflecting who we are and who we are is also a gift. So I don't know if there's any last words you all want to put out before we sort of sign off.
Stay tuned. There's more. Siempre más.
Yeah,
There's
just
gonna
with
be
deep,
so much.
just with deep appreciation y gracias.
Yeah. And let us know what you're interested in and how we can put more information out there as well.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point. Do, you know, feel free to email us, contact us, and let us know what other topics and conversations you'd like to have, because, you know, we want to not be prescriptive and have this type of sessions to be informed by what you all want and need. So stay tuned, like Ida said.
Tan, tan.
Oh my God, I'm like so scared to review the recording. I hope everything went okay. I hope everything was
Do you
recorded.
want to hit the button?